I never saw it coming. You get so used to the way things are, you start to think it's all set in stone, like nothing will ever change. My days were predictable, almost like I was living on autopilot. I'd go to work, come home, and we'd go through the same motions every day. It felt stable, you know? Like everything was secure. Looking back now, I don't remember seeing any clear warning signs. Nothing seemed off, at least not to me. I trusted her completely. Isn't that what marriage is built on? Trust. I thought we had it, no questions asked. For years, I believed everything was fine. We never had big fights, no heated arguments. Things just worked. We each had our own routines. She did her thing, I did mine, and we were like any other couple just making our way through life, side by side. But maybe that was part of the problem. Everything felt too routine, too predictable. I didn't think that could be an issue at the time, though. I was caught up in work, and she seemed just as focused on hers. It never even crossed my mind that cracks could be forming in what I thought was a solid foundation. My wife worked from home as an online German tutor. It seemed like the perfect gig for her. She had flexible hours, could make her own schedule, and it worked well. I didn't really give it much thought. After all, working from home is pretty common these days. She had a knack for languages, so it was a good fit for her. Meanwhile, I had a more traditional job. I worked in an office, dealing with clients face to face, managing a team, you know, the usual. My work wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I was out of the house for most of the day. I'd leave early in the morning and wouldn't get back until the evening. It never seemed strange to me that she was home all day while I was at work. At the end of each day, we'd sit down and talk. She'd tell me about her students, how their lessons were going, and I'd fill her in on what was happening at the office. I didn't see any reason to question it. It seemed like we had a simple setup, and it worked for us. Now, looking back, I wonder if our separate lives during the day were part of the problem. We didn't spend a lot of time together outside of dinner or the weekends, but at the time, it didn't feel like an issue. That's just how life was. Everything seemed fine. But then, things changed. We had this neighbor, an older guy named George, who lived a few houses down. He was the kind of guy who did the same thing every weekend. You'd see him out there mowing his lawn every Saturday morning like clockwork. George had a son, Mike, who was in his early 20s. Mike kept to himself mostly, didn't make a lot of noise. They weren't the kind of neighbors you'd see much of, aside from the occasional wave in passing. But one weekend, we decided to host a small barbecue, nothing fancy, just some burgers, beers, and conversation. We invited George and Mike to join us. It seemed like the neighborly thing to do. As we talked, we got to know them a little better. Mike had this big dream of moving to Germany one day. Apparently, it had been something he'd wanted for years. He was even trying to learn the language, but he wasn't making much progress on his own. George, being a little old-fashioned, asked if my wife could help Mike with his German lessons. He knew she was a tutor, so it seemed like a good fit. My wife was happy to help, and I didn't think anything of it. Why would I? It felt like a nice gesture, just neighbors helping each other out. George seemed pleased, but there was one catch: he wasn't a fan of online tutoring. He believed in face-to-face learning, the old-fashioned way. So, he asked if Mike could come over for in-person lessons. My wife and I exchanged a glance, but neither of us saw any harm in it. We figured, sure, why not? Mike started coming over a few times a week. He'd spend an hour or two with my wife, going over vocabulary, grammar, all the usual stuff when you're learning a new language. I didn't think twice about it. It felt like a straightforward arrangement, just neighbors helping each other out. Besides, Mike wasn't some stranger. He was just the quiet kid from a few doors down. At first, everything seemed fine. My wife would tell me how well Mike was doing, how fast he was picking up the language. She seemed pretty proud of how much he was improving, and I liked hearing her so happy about her work. But after about a week or so, something changed. She stopped talking about Mike. Just like that, she went from being excited about his progress to not mentioning him at all. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured she was just tired or busy with other things. It's normal, right? People get caught up in their own stuff sometimes. But the shift was noticeable. She had gone from being so animated about his lessons to complete silence. I thought about asking her how Mike was doing, but I didn't feel any rush to bring it up. I assumed everything was still fine. Why wouldn't everything be fine? But then, I got a call from George. That's when things really started to unravel. His voice was polite, but there was an edge to it, like he was worried about something. He said he'd been giving Mike a few tests to check how much progress he was making with his German lessons, and something didn't seem right. He said it's strange. Mike was doing really well at first, but now it feels like he's just stuck. He's not improving anymore. He wasn't blaming anyone, but I could tell he was looking for answers. That call stuck with me. If Mike wasn't making progress, why hadn't my wife mentioned it? She used to go on and on about how great he was doing, and now there was nothing. Radio silence. I told George I'd ask her about it, see if I could figure out what was going on. He seemed relieved that I'd look into it. After all, he trusted my wife, but as a father, it made sense that he was concerned about his son's future. After I hung up, I sat there for a while, thinking it over. It was odd that she hadn't mentioned Mike's struggles, especially since she had been so proud of him early on. Maybe she was frustrated that he'd hit a rough patch and didn't want to talk about it. That kind of thing happens, right? Not every student improves at the same pace. Maybe she just didn't want to bother me with the details. I figured I'd bring it up casually the next day, but the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Why had she suddenly gone quiet about Mike's lessons? It wasn't like her. I started feeling this uncomfortable knot in my stomach, but I tried to shake it off. I told myself, people go through ups and downs with their work, maybe she was just tired of talking about it. Then one evening, something happened that made that uneasy feeling even worse. I came home from work to a house that was unusually quiet. No sounds of cooking, no smell of dinner. It wasn't even late, so it struck me as odd. My wife was usually home by then, either finishing up a lesson or just unwinding. I called her, curious about where she was. She answered, sounding cheerful, almost a little too casual. "Oh, I'm just out grabbing coffee with Mike," she said. "He wanted to thank me for all the help I've been giving him." That didn't sit right with me. Coffee with Mike? Out of nowhere. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the whole thing felt off. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. People get coffee. It's normal. Maybe she was just being friendly, or maybe Mike genuinely wanted to show his appreciation. But that feeling gnawed at me. While I had her on the phone, I brought up what George had mentioned. "Hey," George said, "Mike's not improving as much lately. He's concerned about it. What's going on with that?" Her response came a little too quickly. "Oh, George is just being overprotective. He's micromanaging Mike way too much, hovering over him constantly. It's probably stressing the poor kid out. He's doing fine, really." I paused, letting her words sink in. It sounded reasonable. George was the old-fashioned type, and I could easily picture him being overbearing when it came to his son's education. But the way she brushed it off so easily didn't sit right with me. I expected her to give more details, but she seemed eager to move on from the topic. "Okay," I said, not wanting to press her further. She told me she'd be home soon, and I let it go for the moment. But that uneasy feeling stuck with me, growing louder in the back of my mind. When she got home that night, it was like nothing had happened. She walked in with a relaxed smile, tossed her bag on the table, and started complaining about George again, saying he was being too overbearing with Mike. "He's driving the kid crazy," she sighed, always checking in, asking about every little detail. "I'm trying to help Mike, but it's like George can't even see the progress because he's hovering so much." I listened quietly, trying to make sense of it all. She hadn't mentioned Mike in days, and now she was going on about how difficult George was being. It didn't sit well with me. She seemed genuinely irritated, but the way she kept steering the conversation back to George and avoiding any real talk about Mike's progress didn't feel right. "Mike's doing fine," she said again, before continuing her rant about George's interference. I could tell she was trying to shift the focus away from what was really going on, Mike's lack of improvement. It felt like she was distracting me with her frustrations about George instead of addressing the actual problem. I let it go for the moment. I didn't want to push her too hard, but something still felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. The next clue came when we sat down to go over our monthly budget, just like we always did. We've always kept a close eye on our finances, making sure everything lined up. As we were going over her income, something didn't add up. It hadn't changed. The numbers were exactly the same as usual, even though she had been tutoring Mike on top of her regular students. I brought it up casually, trying not to sound suspicious. "Shouldn't your pay be a little higher this month? With Mike, you've got an extra student now, right?" Her response caught me off guard. She shrugged like it was no big deal and said, "Oh, Mike pays in cash. He doesn't transfer it to the bank." I blinked, taken aback for a second. It wasn't unheard of for someone to pay in cash, but it was unusual for her. She always handled her payments through bank transfers. I nodded, pretending it didn't bother me. "Makes sense," I said, though deep down, something about it didn't sit right with me. That night, the thought gnawed at me. If Mike was paying in cash, where was the money? I hadn't seen any of it, and it wasn't like we were sitting on a pile of extra cash. The next evening, I decided to dig a little deeper. I gave George a call, keeping my tone casual. I wasn't accusing anyone, just trying to get a clearer picture. "Hey George, quick question. How's Mike paying for the lessons? My wife said he's been paying in cash, but I wanted to make sure everything's good." George's response raised a red flag that I couldn't ignore. "That's strange," he said. "Mike's been saving up for his trip to Germany. He's been putting all his money in a jar, and I haven't seen him spend much of it. In fact, the jar hasn't gone down lately." His words hit me like a brick. If Mike wasn't paying her, then what was going on? The whole cash story was a lie. Suddenly, everything felt wrong: Mike's lack of progress, the missing payments, and now this strange excuse about money that didn't even exist. I hung up, my mind racing. What were they really doing during those lessons? Why had she stopped talking about Mike's progress so suddenly? And why lie about the cash? I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was definitely going on, and I was determined to find out what. That night, I knew I couldn't keep sitting on these suspicions without doing something about it. I had to get to the truth. So I came up with a plan to investigate without raising her suspicions. The next evening, I suggested we have a movie night. "Let's just relax and watch a couple of movies," I said, trying to sound as casual as possible. I picked a few action flicks I knew she liked, popped some popcorn, and we settled on the couch together. My mind was racing the entire time, but I made sure to keep the atmosphere light and normal. I needed her to feel comfortable, like everything was fine. About halfway through the second movie, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She barely glanced at it, too caught up in the movie to notice. That was my moment. "Hey, your phone's probably low on battery," I said, reaching for it. "Let me plug it in for you." She hesitated for just a second, then shrugged. "Sure, thanks," she said, not suspecting anything. I picked up the phone, pretending to check the battery before plugging it into the charger. It was a small victory, but it felt huge. The phone was now out of her reach, and I knew I'd have a chance to check it later. After the movie ended, we headed to bed. I played it cool, acting like it was just another normal night. But as soon as she fell asleep, I quietly slipped out of bed and went back to the living room. Her phone was still sitting there, charging on the coffee table. My heart was pounding as I picked it up, unlocked it, and started scrolling through her messages. At first, everything seemed normal, just the usual conversations with friends and students. But then, I stumbled upon a conversation in German. My stomach sank. It was with Mike. I don't know German, but thanks to translation apps, I quickly started piecing together what the messages said. They weren't about tutoring anymore. The conversation was filled with flirtatious comments and innuendos, things that made my blood run cold. It was clear they were crossing lines I hadn't even imagined. Then I saw it, a message from Mike saying he'd bring something special the next day. What the hell did that mean? A wave of nausea washed over me as I tried to comprehend what I was seeing. This wasn't just about tutoring anymore. They were meeting up outside of lessons, and it was turning into something more. I sat there, phone in hand, feeling like the walls were closing in. I had to know more. I couldn't confront her just yet, not without more proof. But now, it wasn't just a gut feeling. I knew something was going on. I needed to catch them in the act. The next day, I left work early. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to see for myself what was really happening. I drove home, heart pounding the entire way, and when I got there, I quietly slipped into the house. I hit record on my phone's camera, hoping that somehow, I'd be wrong about all of this. But as I stepped into the bedroom, I was met with a sight that made my blood boil. There was Mike, the neighbor's son, standing right there with my wife. The betrayal hit me like a punch in the gut, and before I knew it, I was shouting, "What the hell are you doing?" As soon as I burst into the room, they both jumped, eyes wide with shock and guilt. Mike scrambled to pull away from her, looking like a deer caught in the headlights. My entire body shook with rage. I could hardly believe what I was seeing, but there they were, caught in the act. "You think you can come into my house and do this?" I yelled, my voice echoing through the room. "We helped you with your German, and this is how you repay us?" Mike didn't say a word. He just stood there frozen, fumbling to gather his clothes, his face pale with fear. I could feel adrenaline coursing through my veins as I took a step toward him. "Get the hell out of my house!" I shouted, pointing toward the door. "And don't ever come back." Without saying a word, Mike bolted, rushing past me and out of the house as fast as he could. I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of anger and satisfaction watching him run like the coward he was. Then I turned to my wife. She sat there, still in shock, guilt written all over her face. I could barely breathe. The betrayal was too much. This woman, the one I'd trusted with everything, had done this, and I couldn't wrap my head around it. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How could you do this to me?" "To us?" she stammered, searching for the right words, but nothing she said would have made it better. I didn't care about her excuses. The damage was done, and there was no going back. I stormed out of the room, heading straight to the closet. Grabbing trash bags, I started throwing her clothes into them, not caring what went where. Each item I tossed felt like ripping apart a piece of our life, and honestly, it felt good. It was cathartic. Behind me, I heard her voice, pleading, "Please stop. We can talk about this. We can fix it." But I wasn't having it. "Fix it? You think I can just forget what I saw?" I snapped, barely stopping to look at her. "You made your choice. Now you live with it." I grabbed as much of her stuff as I could and dragged the bags out to the front yard, dumping them on the grass. She followed me, crying, begging me to stop. But I didn't care. I wasn't stopping, not after what she did. "You don't get to ask for forgiveness," I said, standing firm as she watched me throw her things out like they meant nothing. "You crossed a line, and there's no coming back from that." She stood there, tears streaming down her face, looking completely lost. But my mind was made up. I walked back into the house and slammed the door behind me, leaving her standing in the yard, surrounded by everything she'd just thrown away. It was over. The next day, I called a divorce lawyer. I knew that was it. There was no fixing this, no going back to what we had. The trust was gone, shattered into a million pieces, and I wasn't about to try putting it back together. The divorce process was long and messy, filled with arguments over money, property, and all the little things that had once made up our life together. She tried to apologize, tried to explain, but I wasn't interested. I'd seen the truth, and I couldn't unsee it. As the weeks passed, I started to find a strange sense of peace. Being alone felt better than being with someone I couldn't trust. I threw myself into work and hobbies I hadn't had time for when I was married. I reconnected with friends and began rebuilding my life, piece by piece. Eventually, the divorce was finalized. I walked out of that courthouse a free man, no longer tied to the lies and betrayal that had weighed me down for so long. It was bittersweet, but mostly, I felt relief. I was free. It wasn't easy, and it took time, but I moved on. I started dating again, cautiously at first, bringing the lessons from my past with me. But with time, I realized I could find real, honest connections again. I could rebuild, and I did. In the end, her betrayal was the end of us, but it was also the beginning of something new for me. I had to go through hell to get there, but I came out stronger, knowing exactly what I deserved and what I'd never accept again.